Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Hello, my name is Chris Oberlach, and I'm the World Bank UN Liaison Officer for Somalia. In this podcast, we'll be speaking about operationalizing the humanitarian development and peace nexus in Somalia, taking stock after 2 years of complementary emergency assistance and shock-responsive safety net implementation. In my role, I focus on the partnership between both institutions and identify concrete opportunities to implement the humanitarian development and peace nexus in Somalia. Considering the overlapping crises impacting countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, resulting in over 274 million people requiring humanitarian assistance in 2022, the link between humanitarian and development support has never been as important as it is today. Based on the World Bank Group's Fragility, Conflict and Violence strategy, development partners have gradually entered areas traditionally considered the purview of humanitarian actors in order to provide development support that complements the critical emergency assistance delivered by humanitarians. At the same time, humanitarian actors are focusing on ways in which emergency support can be better utilized to enable sustainable recovery and development. While the importance of partnerships between humanitarian and development actors has been acknowledged during the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, calling for a new way of working to bridge the humanitarian development divide, the conversation has since moved from why do the nexus to how to do the nexus. Somalia is an excellent example of successful initiatives that complement humanitarian and development investments. Today, we're taking a closer look at one sector that has made particular progress in this regard. Social protection is at the forefront of the HDP nexus approach in FCV settings. Lessons learned from Somalia demonstrate how to provide short-term relief to climatic shocks such as drought and flooding, desert locusts, and COVID-19, while at the same time delivering through country systems in order to build the ownership, capacity, resilience, and accountability of the government and local stakeholders. This is critical to build sustainable country systems that deliver support for future crises, and ultimately to strengthen the social contract between citizens and the state, which is essential to helping build the foundations for countries to transition out of fragility over the long term. To discuss some of the specific lessons from Somalia, I'm pleased to be joined by Christina Svensson, the World Bank Country Manager for Somalia, and Al-Khadir Daloum, the World Food Programme Country Director for Somalia. Christina, Al-Khadir, welcome to the podcast. We'll discuss 5 points about the experience in Somalia and explore some of your observations that can inform efforts to deepen the HDP nexus in other FCV contexts. To start with, we hear the term HDP nexus a lot. For both of you, what does the HDP nexus concretely mean in Somalia, and why is it important?
Thank you very much, Chris. It's very nice to be here today with you and with Al-Khadir Daloum from the WFP. For me, in an FCV country like Somalia, partnerships is really the key. Partnerships is key for knowledge, for intelligence, for service delivery, for security, and perhaps most importantly, when it comes to the partnership with WFP and other humanitarian actors who have been well established on the ground, it's essential for the World Bank to deliver support to the most vulnerable communities. In Somalia, the World Bank and our partners are operating in an incredibly difficult and challenging context. Let me just highlight a few points that underscore the difficult operating environment. Over the last 2 years, Somalia has been impacted by several overlapping crises that have deepened existing structural drivers of fragility and conflict. These threaten to reverse hard-won development progress made over the last few years. Challenges include ongoing political tensions and delayed elections, continued threat posed by violent extremist groups like Al-Shabaab, and the triple crisis of COVID-19, desert locusts, and climatic shocks. And as Chris was mentioning, this year promises to be another very challenging year for Somalia, given the onset of another drought that has the potential of impacting a large part of the population. These emerging crises have intensified pre-existing vulnerabilities, such as high levels of insecurity and weak social contract between citizens and state. The capacity is weak to deliver, and the institutions are nascent. They face constrained fiscal space and weak service delivery systems. Ultimately, this poses a serious risk to the country's ongoing transition to establish a stable political settlement and to strengthen the institutions needed to deliver basic services to citizens. Since IDA's re-engagement in 2020 following the HIPC decision point, despite this challenging context, the World Bank has considerably scaled up its portfolio in Somalia. It's today delivering over $1.5 billion US dollars through our active portfolio in a range of sectors. However, given the insecurity on the ground, partnerships again with humanitarian actors are essential, particularly with organizations like WFP, who have a strong presence and established delivery mechanisms across Somalia. And we are able to provide support in the most difficult areas. In short, if we want to work in these contexts, our support and continue to support the most vulnerable communities, partnerships is not an option, but a must. 10 years ago, the World Bank would not be active in these kind of situations. But with the help of the FCV strategy and the operational policy on FCV, it sets as an imperative for us to continue to work in situations of conflict and to do our utmost to protect human capital and institutions. So in Somalia, we are pivoting towards this kind of exciting new partnership model, where the government contracts the UN agencies to support service delivery.
Thank you very much, Chris. And let me build on the important points raised by Christina. The triple crisis posed by COVID-19, major desert locust outbreak, and continuing climate shocks had significant consequences on Somalia's underlying fragility and exacerbated the humanitarian crisis on the ground. The COVID-19 pandemic has hit Somalia hard and impacted the life and livelihood of some of the most vulnerable communities. Somalia has also experienced the worst desert locust outbreak in 25 years, with crop decimated and over 2.6 million people affected. Climate shocks, such as recurrent droughts and flooding, have further compounded this crisis. Given severe drought conditions, current estimates indicate that 4.1 million people in Somalia will need humanitarian food assistance in 2022 to prevent the occurrence of crisis levels of food insecurity. Estimates suggest that the situation is worsening, with projection noting that more areas in southern and central Somalia, also the most impacted by conflict, may fall into emergency level of food insecurity. Altogether, estimated 7.7 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance in 2022, up from 5.9 million in 2021 and 5.2 million in 2020. The case for scaled up humanitarian assistance is obvious, but critically, we need to find ways of addressing the drivers for need and find effective and sustainable ways of sustaining the most vulnerable long term so that they do not regularly require humanitarian assistance. We therefore need to find effective ways to help the government and local stakeholders, strengthen the systems and structures needed to address these recurrent shocks, mitigate their impacts, and build resilience. For these reasons, the partnership with the World Bank is key, as it allows us to work at the intersection of emergency humanitarian support and development assistance, and that is why WFP is a dual mandate agency.
Thank you very much for helping us to understand the landscape and operating conditions better. What does the collaboration between the World Bank and WFP look like in practice? What does each actor bring to the table?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, in response to this frequent crisis facing Somalia, and especially over the last 2 years, the World Bank has focused on employing a people-centered approach by investing in human capital and reaching the most vulnerable communities through the leadership of government and in partnership with humanitarian actors on the ground, such as WFP. One of the best examples in the Somalia portfolio is the partnership and the collaboration around the Bagnano, which means uplifting in Somalia, and is the government's first national cash transfer program established with the support of the bank-funded Somalia Shock Responsive Safety Net for Human Capital project. In a context where about 70% of population lives below the poverty line, and the conditions of frequent shocks that was just outlaid by El Kidir, the program seeks to support the most vulnerable. The World Bank, WFP, and the government of Somalia are also partnering to support the emergency response to the locust crisis through the Somalia Shock Responsive Safety Net for Locust Response project, which operationalizes the shock responsive features of the Bagnano. The aim of this combined 290 million investment is to protect households' physical and human capital assets to enable them to rebuild faster to the impacts of some of the shocks seen in recent years, while establishing and strengthening the country's first large-scale social safety net program. Through the partnership with WFP, the government is leveraging the UN's capacity and systems to deliver cash transfers to poor households, while strengthening its institutional capacity and developing its own systems. The regular Bagnano provides direct cash transfers of $20 per month over 3 years. This gives families predictable supplementary income, stabilize their spending, particularly amid job losses and other shocks like COVID-19, and prioritize their children's health and education. Under the shock responsive part of the program for locust, the Bagnano provides emergency cash assistance of $60 per month for 6 months and enables impacted families to avoid negative coping mechanisms and maintain their household welfare. The project is also improving service delivery and inclusion in the formal financial system by supporting the use of digital payment systems, which provides transfers directly through cell phones. And the interesting part in Somalia here is, of course, that Somalia has one of the highest cell phone penetration rates in East Africa. It also aims to develop a unified social registry, which enhances emergency response and coordination across programs, laying the foundation for a state-led shock responsive safety net system, as well as expanding state-funded social protection system. To date, nearly 190,000 poor and vulnerable households across Somalia have been verified and enrolled and received 4 quarterly payments amounting to $240 per household per year. When fully rolled out, the project will reach 200,000 poor households, some 1.2 million people, to help them access food, healthcare, and education, and again, build resilience to the impacts of COVID-19, drought, and climate-induced floods, and the desert locust infestation. The shock responsive part of the program is covering just as many, for a total of close to 3 million Somalis benefiting from the Bagnano program. Critically, all the direct recipients are mothers or women who are primary caregivers of children under 5 years old. This helps to strengthen their economic autonomy and improve their nutrition and welfare. The efforts are helping families and women build resilience, withstand shocks, and maintain spending on their children's education. Of course, a key to better human capital outcomes.
As Christina mentioned, scaling national social protection systems, including cash-based transfers, has become a key area where humanitarian and development partners can effectively complement their mandates, operational footprint, experience, and technical expertise. WFP has ample experience in providing emergency cash transfers to vulnerable communities in some of the world's most insecure settings, including in Somalia. To this end, we are working closely with the bank and helping the Somali government implement this program, with the aim of eventually handing over the implementation to the government. Ultimately, the program shows how each partner can leverage their expertise to both respond to the immediate crisis at hand while building capacity and the foundations for national social protection system in Somalia where none existed before.
Thank you very much, Christina and Khadir. How does the Bagnano program represent the operationalization of the Nexus in Somalia? You've given us a few examples already. Would you mind elaborating a little bit more, Christina?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, for me, it's really about the complementary skills and capacities that we have to offer. For the World Bank, our support is rooted in building the capacity of the state to strengthen institutions, foster accountability, and promote stronger state-citizen social contract. This is why we're focused on making sure that all our projects invest in core government systems. This is essential for the sustainability of aid and is fully in line with our development mandate and our focus on helping Somalia build the foundations needed to transition out of fragility over the long term. The vision for all partners involved is to contribute to human capital development and transition social service delivery to the government to enhance sustainability. Programs such as the Bagnano are critical in this goal. Through the partnerships with WFP, the program is able to provide Somalia's most vulnerable communities with assistance at a critical juncture, while supporting national institutions to build the capacity to gradually take over the full management responsibility of administering and delivering a national social safety net program. One of the features we are particularly proud of is the shock responsiveness of the program. In 2020, when locusts, COVID-19 and floods began to affect Somalia, we were able to raise additional financing to further scale the Bagnano program. This means that the program was able to cover about 100,000 households with emergency cash assistance in areas affected by locusts. And this is now being scaled up under phase 2 with an additional 160,000 impacted households. Moving forward, this can be a model to reduce the burden carried by humanitarian partners.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm building on Christina. In short, this program is embodiment of two critical foundations of the Nexus. Firstly, it helps us expand our assistance to reach more vulnerable Somalis. For a long time, humanitarian partners were the only provider of cash assistance to communities. Over the course of the last 2 years, we learned how practically complement ongoing humanitarian assistance with the additional reach of the Bagnano program. This is critical given that in Somalia, we see a shortfall against our annual appeals. Secondly, it provides a pathway for the transition from humanitarian assistance towards more sustainable national programs that offer vulnerable people predictable assistance over multiple years. It provides that critical support that allows community to cushion the impacts of shocks to save lives and livelihood, all the while working to build the social protection system needed to more systematically support people the next time they may face a similar crisis. When discussing the humanitarian development peace nexus, we often talk about the tension between the need to strengthen government systems to build much needed long-term systematic resilience and the urgency to deliver emergency support to the most vulnerable groups. However, the Somali experience shows us that we can do both. We can provide rapid support in the face of shocks and build the capacity and ownership of the government over the long term.
Thank you very much for that tangible description. In a nutshell, how would you define the specific value add of this collaboration between the UN and the World Bank in the context of the Bagnano program? El-Hadi.
Let me highlight two key areas of why this specific collaboration is so crucial. First, Bagnano provides predictability for how we can address shocks and support those communities that are most deeply affected by the conflict of crisis impacting Somalia. As Christina highlighted earlier, the program monthly cash transfers are essential lifeline for families. Months after months of these transfers make the difference for families to be able to buy food and clothing and to send their children to school. Second, the shock responsive nature of the safety net is critical. They can adapt and expand in the face of an emerging crisis, whether it be a drought, rising food insecurity, or a new wave of COVID-19, for instance, to help community weather the storm, protect their assets, and preserve human capital gains.
Let me add a few points to this excellent issue raised by El-Kidir. The Bagnano program is designed to be a sustainable, long-term response to the recurrent crisis of Somalia. The work to develop a government-led unified social registry, for example, is critical to helping create that underlying safety net that is so important in the times of crisis. As part of the ongoing debt relief process, the government and international partners have agreed to prioritize the creation and the functioning of a unified social registry as one of the so-called HIPIC completion triggers for the highly indebted poor countries HIPIC process. And this, in my mind, is really key to the ownership of the government and also the motivation of the government to stay engaged and to stay in the leadership role of this initiative. Again, while also working to enhance the government's fiscal and financial outlook, it's a true win-win. For Somalia, programs like these are ultimately pivotal to helping garner the trust of citizens and address one of the key drivers of fragility, namely the real or perceived absence of effective government institutions able to deliver basic services. Furthermore, we know from other FCD contexts, such as Yemen, for example, that these types of national social protection programs can often be among the core institutions that continue delivering crucial support to conflict-affected communities in the wake of crisis or fresh outbreaks of violence.
Thank you very much. I'm impressed by the great upside and the success stories that you've been able to tell, the way that the program is able to adapt flexibly and respond to shocks. Finally, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered in the past 2 years that you would like to address? And maybe any other lessons you learned from Somalia that can help inform engagement across the humanitarian development peace nexus and other FCV contexts, Christina?
Thank you, Chris. I would say it's a continuous learning experience, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work with WFP and with the government on this very exciting initiative. But it's not short of challenges, as you say. First of all, the World Bank Group's FCV strategy emphasizes that partnerships must be mission-driven. This means drawing on the expertise and comparative advantage of each partner to maximize our collective impact on the ground. So in the Bagnano collaboration, WFP has clear capacity, a demonstrated track record, and know-how for delivering large-scale cash transfer programs. and they have the presence on the ground to work, as we have mentioned before, in a challenging and highly volatile context like Somalia. If we want to help the government deliver a social safety net program reaching the most vulnerable communities whilst addressing the impacts of different shocks and crises, working hand in hand is key. Secondly, it's important to keep the focus on the big picture. In this case, it's really about helping to build the capacity, accountability, and systems of the government to cope with the crisis moving forward. While we must respond to the urgent crisis of the moment and help struggling communities in any way we cannot lose the sight of importance of government ownership. And while we have come a long way, there's still many obstacles to address. This includes the lack of data protection legislation, which is one of the key conditions for handing over the social registry created by WFP to the government. The lack of national digital ID is another big challenge that could also help us avoid targeting some of the beneficiaries with different support systems. Weak institutional capacity, of course, is another one. And I would add, in the context of Somalia, the nascent federal system and the relationship with the federal member states and the federal government. There are also challenges with the politicization of assistance, and this requires us to work very closely with policymakers, politicians, officials, and communities to keep the focus on the most vulnerable. We are working with partners to improve targeting criteria and monitoring mechanisms to avoid exclusion and gatekeeping, and to make sure the money reaches those who are most in need. Again, while we have made important progress through our collaboration through the Bagnano, there are challenges and opportunities that we can draw upon further strengthen our impact in Somalia and help inform similar efforts in other FCV countries. I would like to highlight two challenges in particular that we are trying to address. As I mentioned before, the finalization of a unified social registry to help identify vulnerable households faster and more cost efficiently, so we can disperse anticipatory funding before the impacts of the shocks are being felt. This can save time and money and protect lives and livelihoods. Furthermore, the ability to layer additional social services, such as health and education, on top of cash transfers to help beneficiaries graduate out of fragility, poverty, and vulnerability is crucial. We know from literature and experience that cash transfer assistance alone is often not enough, but requires a broad range of complementary human capital support. And we are looking forward to pilot this approach in Somalia moving forward. I would add a third challenge, which is since Somalia is such a fast urbanizing society, and with the large scale of IDPs increasingly coming to the cities, the need to adapt the Bagnano program, which is today mainly a rural program, to become more of a program that works with urban populations would be one of our key priorities as well. Over to you, El-Kidir.
Thank you very much, Christina. Actually, we cannot paint a rosy dream. This cannot continue without a challenge. And from my end, let me conclude by highlighting that for social safety nets to be effective in crisis context, we rely on effective targeting and speed of delivery. Allow me to leave you with two thoughts. First, one of the key impediments to timely delivery of assistance in the context of shocks is that we do not raise resources until events have unfolded. We know that currently we have about 4 million people that require urgent assistance, yet our response only raised a fraction of our needs. The availability of contingency funding for shock responses safety net would be a game changer in that regard. Second, let me emphasize the importance of effectively targeting assistance to the communities and individuals that need it the most. In Somalia, we have seen that women have been disproportionately affected by the triple crisis, as well as the impacts of ongoing fragility and conflict. 8 out of 10 working women are engaged in vulnerable occupations, such as farming, often low paid, lacking contracts, and with inadequate support system, such as medical insurance to help meet health care expenses or social security payments that could help family members survive a severe illness or disability. Targeting is difficult, and we encounter challenges of systematic exclusion in Somalia. We are therefore working with the government and the World Bank to building targeting mechanisms that are systematized and allow us to avoid people being left behind. One of the ways that the Bagnano project does is by targeting the cash transfer to women to provide them and their children with much needed support. Having a granular understanding of vulnerability and characteristics of exclusions allow us to design the program accordingly and provide an effective response. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you so much to Christina and Hadir for this insightful and frank conversation. There are a few lessons learned from the Somalia experience and the collaboration between the World Bank and the WFP that can help inform how we think about the operationalization of the humanitarian development and peace nexus. I'd like to leave you with 3 key messages that I took away from today's conversation. First, the importance of developing a clear joint vision across humanitarian and development partners, including the government, based on a common understanding of the major challenges. Secondly, using partnerships to build off each other's comparative advantages, both operationally and strategically. And lastly, building shock responsive components into development projects that are agile and nimble to respond quickly in the context of different crises. We hope that some of these lessons from Somalia inspire similar efforts in other FCV contexts.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcasts. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.